Tony Cattinger. What an absolute honor it is to welcome you back to Boundless Body Radio.
Hi, Casey. I did not realize I'd been here this many times.
You have been here a lot of times. That must be a record. It's either you or Nicole Ron are very, very close to the number of appearances on our show. We just love
And I love
talking.
her too.
She's amazing. I know. I love talking with both of you. We always have very interesting conversations. There's always something to, I find, like remember about oxalate. We're always learning new things. And I know you, for one, are constantly doing research. Do you have to constantly remind yourself of how important this topic is? Do you find it interesting that you're continuing to learn about this, even though it's pretty much all you do and focus on is like researching oxalate? Does it ever surprise you that there's still so much stuff there, not only to learn, but to remind yourself of?
You know, honestly, I'm sorry I didn't wear my t-shirt. I had my team do some graphics, and the t-shirt is a joke that I've been saying for years. And the joke is, when in doubt, blame oxalate.
You've told me you were going to make that t-shirt. You finally did.
I've got it. I've got it.
Nice.
I'm trying to get it available to people, but yep, I've got it. And the thing is that continues to astound me that like so many different kinds of health issues that we really haven't been tracking from an oxalate standpoint do in fact have oxalate touch points. And while oxalate might not be the only driver of bad things happening in people's diets, it's certainly a confounder, which can be affecting all kinds of things. And I'm sure I've heard this many times before. Your genetics might load the gun, but your environment pulls the trigger. And I'm more and more wondering about things that are inflammatory that are in our diet pulling the trigger that sets us up for some of these health things that happen to us. So yeah, when in doubt, blame oxalate continues to be kind of a theme in my life. And I keep finding researchers who are doing fascinating stuff, you know, both because of my involvement with the Triangle Oxalates group. Susan Owens, who is the original founder there, has, you know, fingers into a lot of different areas of science and manages to network with lots of scientists. So we get exposure to different kinds of things that oxalate's related to. And I continue to volunteer there and kind of pay forward some of my expertise. And then between that and just diving into the research myself, because I get curious, like, how does this hook up with this? And then like sometimes I'm like, sure enough, there's the oxalate linkage, or there's the linkage that shows how oxalate and histamine and salicylate might be in fact affecting here. It's an amazing area to be working in, because if you're a curious person, there's a lot going on.
Wow. Yeah, that's very interesting. It's funny to go back and listen to some of the episodes that you and I have done, or some of the episodes I've done with Sally Norton over the years. You know, we've done 3 or 4 different episodes, and you would think covering this one topic, there would be so much crossover between all the episodes that we've done, and they're all unique. Like, we find something new to talk about every single time. And so it's very interesting. I learn something new every single time that we chat. And of course, this is going to be speculation, but I want to hear your opinion about this. For what percentage of the population do you think oxalate is an issue for that is going unrecognized?
Back to when in doubt, blame oxalate. Like, we have all kinds of epidemic inflammatory conditions out there. I'm now in my 60s, not that I like to own up to that too often, but like all my friends are dealing with, you know, it might be cancer, or it might be chronic asthma, or it might be, it seems like everybody I know in their 60s is taking high blood pressure medication or something. And the more I look at the systems that are being affected, you know, lungs, cardiovascular, there's oxalate touch points there. So, and we've got, of course, the obesity epidemic, and the most recent rabbit hole I was down was looking at how our metabolic health, so our status is, you know, either syndrome X or prediabetes or diabetes, affects your risk of things like kidney stones. So kidney stones being one of the most common ways that people are dealing with oxalate. And oh my gosh, that just sends your oxalate risk up really high. So it's not just what's in our diet either. It's what our body might be producing. And there might be something about diabetes, prediabetes, blah, 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 that drives up our oxalate production, our natural oxalate production. So when you look at the population being, what are we at, like 80% of us are overweight or obese? Like, I'm afraid to say a number because I'm afraid of how high the number would be that I'd be saying. But if you just look at the SAD diet, right? The one that nobody really wants anybody to be eating, but where where your basic starches would be things like potatoes, and it's very, low in nutrients. And the replacement to regular potatoes is now sweet potato fries. So you've got these things which are really high in oxalate with a nutrient deprived kind of diet. I think that sets just about everybody up for it. And then you find people trying to eat better. And as we've talked about before, if you're doing everything right and you're getting sicker, that might be oxalate, because maybe you've gone out to put all these superfoods in your diet. So your quinoa, if you're not eating regular wheat, and your sweet potato instead of your potato, and your spinach for your greens, and your chia for your fiber. And all of a sudden, and your almonds for a snack. And all of a sudden you're taking in 1,500 milligrams of oxalate a day. And if you look at some of the resources on what we should consider a normal amount of oxalate for you to be excreting in urine per day, that would be, I think the Mayo Clinic had it at about 45 milligrams of oxalate in your urine. I'd have to check this to make sure, because some of these criteria are changing. But at one point, the Mayo Clinic for sure had 45 milligrams of oxalate in your urine per day could qualify you for hyperoxaluria. And you're taking in 1,500 a day.
Wow.
Honestly, there's so many factors here that might be setting us up for problems with oxalate, and not the least of which is we know now that antibiotics have huge impacts on the gut. And one of the things they're doing is generally the kinds of bacteria that degrade oxalate or use oxalate for their food that we would have in our gut, which would help to protect us from some of it. Well, if those are being killed off by antibiotics, then you're also more vulnerable. Just a crazy perfect storm of things.
Wow, it really is. And it's, fun to be in the nutrition world and squabble about what is the biggest harm. Is it the sugar? Is it the starch? Is it the seed oils? Is it the food dyes? Like, we can probably all agree that it might be all of those things. They might be acting together. But the number that you mentioned, 45 grams, that's like a high-end kind of maximum of what can be excreted through the urine.
I don't know if that's the high-end maximum, because I've had what they call a 24-hour urine assay for oxalate. I managed to talk my doctor into doing that, despite the fact that I'd had no kidney stones. So he really didn't think that I had an oxalate problem at the time. Gosh, this is years ago now. And I went and I had one of those tests. And when I got back the results, I had 293 milligrams of oxalate in my daily urine. So it's not that 45 milligrams is the max. It's that at that point in time, it was the threshold whereby then they said, you've got too much oxalate in your urine, so something's going on. So if you pass that threshold at 45 milligrams, if a regular human being like me, who was trying to eat extra healthy, could do a random test like that and get 293, it then makes sense why my doctor said, I'm not sure about this, because they're calling up to 300 milligrams normal. They're moving some of the goalposts because so many people throw these high numbers. But back in the day, when the original threshold was set, it had to be on a much lower intake than what we've got now. But
Wow.
We've abandoned traditional ways of processing some food. I mean, honestly, we think that we're kind of smarter than previous generations, right? So my grandmother's, boiled spinach with a cream sauce. Oh, that's terrible. We eat it raw because it's better that way. Well, there's a lot more oxalate that way too. So we really have all kinds of things going on where just because oxalate's not tracked unless you have a kidney stone or unless your kidneys are failing, then they'll start to track oxalate. But until then, it's like the invisible factor in your health profile. And that's why I say when in doubt, blame oxalate, because we're not looking for that. It's kind of like back in the day where everybody didn't really think that cigarette smoking was that bad until we started to look at it, right? So I think we have the same problem with oxalate. We haven't been looking at it, so we didn't realize it was related to any of these things. But honestly, there's more going on there than meets the eye.
I remember as a kid when all of a sudden it was the potato skins. Like the potato skins were the healthiest part of the potato, and we wouldn't skin our potatoes anymore. And you eat the skin because that's where all the nutrients were. I remember oh, this is different, but whatever. So throw some margarine in here and have a nice little baked potato with skin on. I've always thought of it as such a cruel trick of oxalate that it's the people that you mentioned, right? It's the people that take the step to improve their health. They're finally conscious of it. They're sick of the standard American diet, the SAD diet. And so they take steps to improve. And you see the spinach and you see the chia and the chard and all this stuff comes in. And, maybe they don't even like it. They don't like eating this stuff raw, but they do it because it's for their health. But the thing that I've been appreciating a lot more recently recently is kind of like you said when I asked the question, what percentage of people do you think this is bothering? Even that person on a standard American diet, not eating for their health. It's kind of interesting to think like how little of a tolerance for some of those foods, chocolate, potatoes, a few of those things per day in your diet, and you could be in just as much trouble and you're completely unaware of it. And yeah, even though you're not eating for health and not going out of your way to eat spinach, there's other ways that you can accumulate it pretty quick.
Oh, potato chips are probably one of the most common ones. I know people who picked up chocolate covered almonds because they thought, well, chocolate's good for you. Almonds are good for you. Yeah, that's like a double barreled problem. Or they picked up dark chocolate, and the darker the chocolate, the more oxalate is present. So the difficult thing here is that if you're not really paying attention, all kinds of things can be going on. And we just seem very committed to things like chia being really good for us. Actually, the most recent one, which really has my attention, because people are going to mushroom coffee because they're abandoning coffee. I desperately looked for one that does not have chaga mushroom in it. Why? Chaga, up to 1/5 of the mass of chaga can be oxalate. That puts it at a level. Spinach is an amateur in comparison to that. And we're putting it in everything. And my daughter, who is very oxalate literate because she's grown up with this diet, she was over at her boyfriend's house. His sister had brought this funky mushroom coffee and they were all raving about it. And he said, I had a cup and I didn't feel very good. My daughter looked at the label and she went, don't drink this, because it had chaga as like one of the first or second ingredients. And so when you're talking about a food that can have 200 milligrams of oxalate per gram of the food, it's not really food. I wouldn't even call that food anymore. So yeah, we keep finding these novel, interesting things, and people enjoy being foodies, so they want to try something new. So I've been seeing a lot more posts that are using chia or chaga or star fruit. And again, I went into the research. Star fruit is another one that's really high oxalate. I'll see these influencers giving slices of it to their little baby or whatever, and I'm just cringing because there's just so much oxalate in there. There are case studies of people being poisoned by it.
Fatal in some cases, right, with star fruit?
Can be fatal. Yeah, if you've got people who are really committed to this as a fruit, like maybe they've got a tree growing on their property, they could be consuming crazy amounts of oxalate.
Wow.
And we just don't know. But we're foodies. We want to try something new. Look at this. Isn't this interesting? And
well, okay. We've done this before, but I want to do it again. Can you remind us what the family of oxalate is, what that includes? There's a mechanical component. There's also a chemical component. You're just such a pro at explaining this, and I don't think you can be explained enough. So can you tell us and remind us what oxalate actually is?
Sure. Oxalate is a chemical. It is a negatively charged anion. So biochemically, one of the things that it does in the body as a negatively charged ion is look for a positively charged, as I call it, dance partner. Unfortunately for us, the most common dance partners preferred by oxalate would include things like calcium and magnesium and potassium and zinc and iron and things that are important in our bodies. So we can be losing electrolytes, like even potassium and sodium can end up bound to oxalate, but we can also be losing some of these big guy minerals that we need, calcium, big for bones, magnesium, important to metabolic functions all through the body, iron. So that is probably job number one when it comes to dealing with oxalate, is that your bloodstream may not show obvious deficiency, but down at the tissues, your tissues could be getting shorted on minerals because your body's trying to protect the bloodstream's levels for urgent function. So we tend to not realize we've got a problem until it's so bad that the blood values drop. So most of us are going to be deficient in minerals through a combination of our diet's not mineral dense enough and oxalate's depleting us. That's kind of part of the biochemistry, is this chelation aspect. Next part of the biochemistry is that it drives inflammation. So heaven help us, if you've got an injury, if you've got an infection, oxalate can end up being attracted, if you will, to the sites of that process, and you can end up with it stored there. So I've had clients who had, let's say, a hip replacement as an example, where, they were eating a high oxalate diet at the time, time, they start to reduce their oxalate. They're like, all of a sudden my hip is hurting and I don't know why. And it's like, well, I know why. It's because you had hip surgery and you've got some oxalate stored there. Or people will say, I fell and I cracked my tailbone, 20 years ago ice skating, and all of a sudden it's hurting again. At the time, you had inflammation. Oxalate was attracted to the site of that, and it may be stored where that has happened. But I mean, lots of times we can have low grade inflammation going on in the body. You can hear me clearing my throat all the time. It's like seasonal allergies. And I realized I forgot to take my antihistamine this morning. But that's another thing that can get driven, because you've got this mild inflammation in the lungs because the pollen's irritating you. Oxalate gets involved there and it starts to make it worse. So I know people whose asthma gets worse when they're dealing with oxalate. My son is one of those. I'm so low oxalate, I just have allergies. But there can be places where oxalate's tangling with this biochemistry that helps to drive inflammation. You can get a physical inflammation from oxalate. And the best example of that is kidney stones. So oxalate's bound up with magnesium. The kidneys have then scraped that oxalate out of the bloodstream. It precipitates out in the urine and you end up with a kidney stone. Well, you can get microcrystals of oxalate that might occur in your gut, because if oxalate's being released from food and you've got minerals present, that oxalate may bind with those minerals. And so that can be irritating the gut. Or if the food that you ate has oxalate crystals in it, like things like spinach where it's gritty on your teeth, you actually have physical oxalate microcrystals there. Well, your gut's being kind of scraped by sandpaper when you've got something like that. That's not happy either. So you've got those kinds of things that it can do. But perhaps one of the things that I think is probably more insidious is it can get taken up into the tissues and disrupt function. So sure, you can have crystals which might precipitate in the urine, or by the way, in your joints, or in the gut. You can have these different kinds of stones, and gallstones can actually be oxalate related too. So you can have different kinds of stones that are oxalate related. But once it's down into the tissues and gets taken up by a cell, the problem there is now it's a mitochondrial toxin. So your mitochondria will be, your little engines will be going, you're not going to be very happy. And if you're not producing enough energy, then all of a sudden the tissues can't do the work they're supposed to do. And maybe you have a chronic fatigue diagnosis. It's not just that your adrenals aren't functioning, it's that you're tired all over, right? Or maybe you have brain fog, or maybe your liver isn't detoxing as it should, because these are all places where oxalate can be taken up. And unfortunately, the liver is one of those, I'm going to say, more susceptible tissues because of the kinds of nutrients it uses. So down at this biochemistry at the tissue and cell level, if you have a cell that needs bicarbonate, chloride, or sulfate, and note that's a lot of tissues in our body are using one or all of these, those kinds of cell transporters will often move oxalate as well. So that means you can end up with a situation where your little cell transporter, think of it as a hand, getting a nutrient to pull into the cell. It's got an ending here, so to speak, that's going to fit either, say in the case of the liver, sulfate or oxalate. If it goes out and it pulls in an oxalate molecule, that cell will choose to use its energy to try and get the nutrient it wanted. So essentially the cell transporter does the equivalent of drop the trash, and the cell uses the energy to send the cell transporter back out again. And so relentlessly over time, if your oxalate in the body's too high, that cell will be accumulating that oxalate, and it will keep choosing to use its energy for the most important function. And so that means that you may not be moving oxalate out in a timely enough fashion, and then the cell's not functioning very well. Well, again, if we're thinking about how many people might have an oxalate problem, how many people do you know don't digest their food well, or have to take ox bile or some kind of digestive enzyme combination to try and handle their food, or have been told they have fat malabsorption? All we're talking about right now is the liver. We're not talking about any of the other places where this is happening. So it's a multi-pronged toxin because it's functioning at all these different levels. And that's how it can go unnoticed as well. Because if I'm tired, well, I'm just tired. Maybe I'm aging. Maybe I'm whatever. Like by the time you see gross, obvious effects, oxalate's probably been at work for a decade, 2 decades. 3 decades. Who knows?
That's crazy. Everything that you described is super, super common. Most people, I'd say, could relate to at least some of that, whether they feel like they're eating well or not. Probably most people experience what you've already mentioned. And it's so funny how like the history of this goes back so far. As I was listening to Sally's book again recently, she's got a whole bunch of quotes in there that she quotes from several authors. And the quotes go back to like the 1800s. What are some of the uses for oxalate that we found, even knowing that it wasn't great for us to ingest it, but we've used oxalate for things like cleaning products? Do you know much about like what we have like used oxalate for?
Mostly what I'm aware of as a good use of oxalate has been cleaning products. So if people are not aware of Barkeeper's Friend, this has been well known. It's been around as a cleaner for ages. And honestly, before people realized they had to use gloves to work with it, I'm sure that there were people who got oxalate toxic because they were using this all the time to clean. But oxalic acid is really great for things like taking rust off things. It was called Barkeeper's Friends because bars would get messy, right? So it's great. But other uses for it, it is an acid. So in places where you have use for industrial acids to do certain kinds of processes, I don't know where specifically it may have been used, but it's been known as an acid for a long time. So I can imagine it being used in different kinds of situations. But it would not at this point be my first choice for a cleaning product unless I was decked out in hazmat gear.
That's what it sounds like. I'm glad I don't use it. And all of this is to say, like, even that is us extracting this thing from plants, and plants are using it for their own use. It's not this thing made for us to go take from these plants. The plants use it for their own purposes. Can you explain like some of the things that oxalate is used for inside of plants?
Plants use it very capably and for a lot of really good purposes. So while it's a metabolic end product for us, so we make some, but we know we're supposed to get rid of it, or at least our bodies know we're supposed to get rid of it. With plants, you can be using it productively to bring minerals into the plant. It's a mineral chelator. It's one of those things that plants will use to grab minerals and get it into their system. But with a plant, the plant has the pathways to break it down again. So we don't have those pathways. So plants can use it for mineral uptake. They can be using it for defense. So I don't know if you've ever done gardening, but we used to grow spinach when I was a kid. And my mom used to actually put stuff on it to keep bugs away from the spinach. But I don't think the spinach needed anything because I don't think the bugs ever really ate it. And it turns out that those crystals, that gritty feeling, what happens is it breaks up the insect's mouth. And so if your predator can no longer predate, you've kind of fulfilled your purpose there. So protection for plants from predation is one of the things that oxalate's good for. And plants can actually use it in its crystalline structure, like for their leaves, to absorb and magnify sunlight. From a plant standpoint, you've got some really helpful things that oxalate can do for you, but you also have the metabolic pathways to handle it. So it's not an end product for them. It's something that's fully integrated into how they're operating and how they're growing and how they're managing their existence. For us, oxalate's a metabolic endpoint, and then we move it by secretion to get it out. And because secretion takes energy, that speaks to why cells might decide to just drop it and then try and get what they're after with a cell transporter. Because for us, it's a costly function and it's strictly to get rid of it. And that's where I start to laugh when people say, well, maybe it's got a productive use in our bodies. No, not so much. But it's definitely for plants. It's been something that plants have worked with over eons. So some plants are using it for protection, others are not. It depends on how the plant's been able to make use of oxalate, but I think virtually everybody can use it for mineral uptake into their structure. And again, some to make sure that they're getting the most out of the sunlight that gets to them. So it's a very interesting compound.
Wow. That's fascinating. Thank you for explaining that. And I told you this before. You mentioned the kind of mouthfeel of the mechanics of the crystals. I've told you this before, that as I'm trying to pitch this idea to somebody, that's the example I'll use because people can relate to that. They chew up a raw piece of spinach. How does your mouth feel? Everybody says, oh, it's that weird grittiness. And you're explaining the mechanical part of things and even being aware that, like you said, like as soon as it gets in your mouth, it's causing damage to your teeth. And we've always kind of known like any kind of disease that or originates in the mouth then seems to be like the forerunner to other metabolic diseases that come a little bit later on. But it seems like the mouth is one of the first places that affected. And knowing that the chemical aspect and what is chelating in your body is so much worse than the mechanical aspect. Like, yeah, it's not great that you're chewing up glass or sandpaper and that's going through your digestive system and causing damage to your teeth and your intestines and stomach and all that stuff. Knowing that what is actually getting inside that is so much worse and causing so much other damage, it's really interesting to fathom.
Yeah, it's astonishing to think that really the digestive tract from mouth all the way through is ground zero for this. And yet we're not paying any attention to that. The only place we look at is in the kidneys, right? But ground zero is really the mouth and the whole digestive tract.
Yeah.
But we're going to say things like, oh, I have leaky gut, so I have to go and I have to take all these specialized supplements. Oh, why don't you just get rid of the thing that's causing your gut to be inflamed, and then it may not be so leaky, right?
Yeah.
Like there's lots of places where I think we're looking for a complicated solution to a problem that might be simpler than we think it is, although reducing oxalate and getting it out of your system is kind of a long-term challenge. And a lot of people aren't really prepared for that.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about that for sure. But let's talk about the secretion part of things. Again, it's so interesting that getting into the body, it's causing damage. Getting stored and withheld in the body, it's causing damage. Then coming out is also going to cause damage. It's like every direction, every part of the process is causing damage. So what is determining how the body excretes oxalate and how much, like the quantity that it's getting rid of?
I think there's a lot of things that can be at play there. So we could have genetics that governs secretion in our bodies and makes us more or less effective at it. I do not claim to have any knowledge of that. I just know from the periphery that there are things that can have impact there. So we might be not as good at others as secreting things out. We could have a situation where we are more likely than others to absorb oxalate. So we could be getting more in than other people, which then would put more pressure on being able to get rid of it. So there can be that kind of aspect to how we get it out. And because it leaves by secretion, we actually can have oxalate leaving the body in ways that we don't expect. So while the kidneys will do the lion's share of the work for most people, because they're constantly sweeping things out of the bloodstream, and then they will be taking the oxalate and secreting it into the urine, and that will be happening. We do have mechanisms in the body to secrete toxins back into the gut. So it turned out, I found this really fascinating, that you can get intestinal stones and that they can be oxalate based because we can be secreting oxalate back into the intestines to dispose of it. So that's one of the ways we can be moving it. There are cell transporters in the lungs that can be dealing with secreting oxalate. This is all tied up with a cystic fibrosis genes and the class of cell transporters that are related to cystic fibrosis. Again, I am not a genetics expert, but I have memorized that it's the SLC 26A class of cell transporters, and I'll
Come on,
check
everybody
to make sure
knows
that's
that.
correct.
Everybody knows that. Come on.
Some of it just becomes alphabet soup for me. It's terrible. So we can actually be secreting oxalate out into the mucus in the lungs. So it is understood that oxalate's a factor in things like cystic fibrosis, which is astonishing to me that we would know that and yet never think about somebody having asthma or something else as being related to oxalate. We can be secreting it essentially any way that we secrete, which means that I have had clients who have had it moving out through the skin. I've even had people who had crystals coming out through their skin, which was wild. And I've also experienced myself the joys of having oxalate move out through your tear ducts, because you've got secretion as a factor there in terms of moving out tears. So really, if you've got the capacity to secrete from a particular location in the body, and in some cases also related to things like mucous membranes, so in the sinuses, in the lungs, then you can be moving oxalate out that way. And for people who have a big onboard toxicity of oxalate, they're the ones who are most likely to show more of these systems and have more stress on more of these systems. So it's really difficult because it doesn't fit a profile nicely. Like the thing about most diseases is there's a diagnostic profile and you can check the boxes and then they sort of know a category for you. There's so many touch points here, Casey. It's just, it does get like when in doubt, blame oxalate.
Yeah, seriously. proven to be true. And one of the diseases I've asked you about in the past, I'll always ask about, which is breast cancer. My mom made homemade meals for the most part. We did, do raw spinach. We did do potatoes with the skin on it. I had, lots of peanut butter for lunch, peanut butter sandwiches every single day. And especially when my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer, and this is 1998, 99, somewhere in there, we made the switch. We're eating healthier foods. So we're eating low fat. There was a lot more the carbohydrate that was getting in there. We would bring her jamba juices for her chemotherapy treatments because she loved that kind of thing. And I always wonder, was this a part of it? So what do we know about breast cancer and oxalate in particular? Is that another excretion factor that we need to be thinking about?
I do think that this could be related to secretion because the milk ducts, that's a secretion process. And the challenge is really that it looks like oxalate does irritate breast tissue. There's research where the title of the research article, and as most of us who have read research know, research articles are often kind of vague or they're only really specific if they're down at like little tiny nuts and bolts. But this particular piece of research on breast cancer said that oxalate induces breast cancer. That's pretty strong language. And so I've actually written an article on this. It's up on a website called Hormones Matter, which is run by Chandler Mars, who is a PhD and is very interested in nutrition and particularly has a lot of things on thiamine and therapeutic use of thiamine. So there is an article by me on breast cancer and oxalate on that website where I tried to connect the dots as much as possible regarding kind of bioaccumulation, the research that we have on breast cancer, and why this would be important because this is huge. Another one of those things that people talk about all the time is the epidemic of breast cancer. Well, what if us trying to eat extra healthy is actually driving some of this? I mean, it's just so ironic. So ironic that you're trying to get healthier and you're making yourself sicker. It's frustrating. But for sure, when I see these influencers are saying, oh, we need to protect our hormones and we need to do this and we need to do that. And here's the green smoothie I drink in the morning. And it doesn't even sound tasty, right? It's like 5 handfuls of spinach and thinking, yuck. But the problem there is these are well-intentioned people who think you're upping your game. But what if you're not? What if you're not? And there are researchers now looking at even in the areas of things like cardiovascular health, finding that what if that plaque inside the arteries is calcium oxalate driven. When I read that, the hair stood up on the back of my neck, right? I was like, we really need to pay attention here. We're like sitting in the dark, plugging our ears, going la, 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 and there's stuff happening. So I've really become very committed to this idea of essential nutrient dense, low toxin. That's my tagline for how you should eat. Essential nutrient dense. What are the essential nutrients? Fatty acids and amino acids. That's going to bias you already in a direction, right? And then low toxin, I don't just think about pesticides and things like that anymore. What's inherent to that food? What toxins are inherent to that food? And then pick carefully, right? I'm not saying to people that they shouldn't eat ever any plants because I have some very healthy omnivore clients and I'm very happy for them. But I think you should do a cost benefit analysis essentially on what ones you're going to eat and make sure that they're the lowest in kind of big ticket toxins and that you're getting the best bang for the buck if you're going to eat them. So do I occasionally have something? Yes, I do. So yesterday was Mother's Day. And my son decided that he had to have a dessert and he provided watermelon. And I happily had a slice of watermelon. But, do I eat a lot of plants? I certainly don't. I'm maybe not 100% carnivore, but I'm pretty darn close other than the occasional, my kids want to do something nice for me and they buy watermelon and I like watermelon.
Lovely. Yeah, I get it. You've made this point before and Dr. Eric Westman did an entire talk about this where it's something he tells his patients. He's like, what are my patients made of? Well, they're made of water, they're made of protein, and they're made of fat. And he shows the amounts of all of those things in the body and shows the amount of carbohydrates. And the amount of carbohydrate really depends on your muscle mass, but it's about 1,500 to 2,000 calories depending on the person, which is like a minuscule amount. And then he just uses that to say like, okay, well, based on what you're made of, what do you think you should be eating? And people make the connection. So I really do appreciate that. And it takes us to what I think of is like one of the more frustrating aspects of all of this is like once somebody has listened up to this point and they say, yeah, I'm in. I want to get these things out of my diet. I don't want to eat these ever again. I'm motivated. I never liked spinach anyway. I never ended up looking like Popeye. I thought it was going to. It's false advertising. I'm just going to get these out and never eat them ever again. It's such a bummer. Can you tell us why that may or may not necessarily be the best idea?
Yeah, it's definitely not the best idea. We touched on it a little bit earlier. Like they're toxic on the way in, they're toxic on the way out. And so what we want to do is have them leave the body, but in a way that's as controlled and measured as possible. And that's not something we have total conscious control over because, the subconscious is dealing with most of the things that are going on in the body. So what we need to do is think about kind of a measured amount of the toxin, if you will. So we want to come off it slowly so that we're not doing a bunch of things. We're not throwing the body under the bus and then the body's trying to move as much oxalate as it can at once. So the amount of oxalate that came in at the time when you took it in, let's say you started eating healthy in your 20s and you're in your 40s and you're having problems now. So you might have 15 or 20 years of oxalate in there. But at the time when you were first taking it in, it was little bits at a time, right? Well, now if you drop all the oxalate that's in your diet all at once, your body's going to hit your bloodstream with a wave of oxalate, and the intensity of the symptoms that it can drive because of all the things we talked about that it can do can be really significant. And back when I went low oxalate, which is now an astonishing to me 17 years ago, we didn't know about that. And I did waltz my butt into ER a couple of times. This is not what anybody wants to be doing as part of this process. So if you think about, for those who know anyway, about heavy metal toxicity and how careful you have to be when you're chelating it out, like you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to mobilize too much. You want to stay within the bandwidth that the body can handle at any point in time. Well, the kinds of rules like that for heavy metal removal are pretty much the kinds of rules you should follow for oxalate removal. Because it does get this additional kick at the can, and we're more vulnerable 20 years down the line than we were when we first started eating high oxalate. So that's the other thing. Your health status isn't the same as when it went in. So we just need to think about, okay, I'm going to bring it down. I might even bring it down very slowly because I don't want to overdo how much oxalate my body's going to want to start to get rid of then, because you need to be able to weather this process too. If you start at it too hard and it's leaving the body too aggressively, then you can end up with other kinds of problems that I've seen people end up with, which is really from the abuse the immune system's getting as everything's leaving. So all this inflammation is being driven, the mast cells are being irritated, all kinds of things are happening. And for people who eat extraordinarily high diets, they can be having the same problem because just too much is coming in. So the immune system's being hammered, the mast cells are not happy. But for those people, you can end up with mast cell activation disorder. I'm very suspicious that that oxalate really has a lot to do with it. Again, multiple factors in our world, but that this is one of the players. You can end up with, when the immune system's overreactive like that, then you can drive up the reactivity of the nervous system. So I know that one of my least favorite symptoms while I was going through oxalate moving out was things like anxiety and even histamine flares and all kinds of things that I was not expecting and that we could avoid if we pull down more slowly. I do not agree with practitioners who say, oh, just dive down to this level. And then I think people need to look at their individual place in terms of how much oxalate have they been taking in. If you've been one of those overachievers and you've been taking in 3,000 or better, and I've had clients at that level, you better work with somebody to come down real slow and help you have the patience to deal with it. If your health is very fragile, even if your diet wasn't immensely high in oxalate, you have to take into account how much resilience you've got. Do you have other kinds of diagnoses already? If you do, again, you might need some help because oxalate's pro-inflammatory. If you've got a diagnosis of one kind or another, it could make that worse. And honestly, there are some really simple strategies that can be helpful here. I sometimes have people do kind of a wave where they have a higher oxalate day, a mid, a low, and then maybe they stay low for a day or two, and then maybe they go back up to the high and do this again. Because what that intermittency does is keep your body paying attention to what's going on. So your body's going to fight for homeostasis, right? I want a predictable something. If I'm the subconscious trying to deal with the body, I want a predictable something. So if it looks like you've dropped oxalate and you're staying low, I've got a predictable something. I'm going to start moving lots of oxalate. Okay, so we don't want it to do that. So if you're doing this, then the body has to go, oh, I can move some. Oh, okay, now I have to wait. Oh, I can move some more. Oh, now I have to wait. But if you sort of push back, if you will, at the body with a little bit of oxalate, measured dose, let me say measured dose of oxalate in the gut, then the body will oftentimes respond with, okay, I have to make the tissues wait because I've got this stuff in the gut. And so I have to make sure that gets cleared before I do the next thing. So there can be a little bit of nuance. Maybe even we're kind of waltzing. We're doing a little bit of a waltz with this, right? You're going in the right direction, but you just can't linearly go there. It's a little more like waltzing or sailing, right? You know where you want to go when you're sailing, but if you've ever sailed, you know you're going to have to tack. That's really what we have to think about when it comes to oxalate.
That's a good explanation. If I were working with you and you were telling me that, I would fight back against you so hard. I would resist that idea because I'm so convinced that I don't want to eat any more spinach and sweet potato. And so to hear that I have got to work it back in every third, fourth, fifth day, whatever it is, I would resist it so hard until I probably had a really nasty dump and suffered so poorly that I was like, oh, you were right. And I wish I would have listened to you in the first place. And you mentioned something just now that I want to just see if there's anything else you've learned about it. We were talking off air and you were mentioning the effects of like the nervous system and as another rabbit hole you kind of dove down recently. You just mentioned like anxiety, and we kind of think of that almost, and a lot of times it's a flaw with somebody, with their mental health or whatever. They're just a, anxious kind of person. Can you tell us anything you've learned recently about the nervous system and how that can relate to everything we talked about today?
Yeah, I think I would kind of describe it, let's say in layperson's terms, your immune system's getting more and more worked up. You've got all this inflammation going on. That's the immune system's reason for existing. If you've got inflammation going on because of something like oxalate, it's still going to be on the immune system's radar. And the immune system will be looking at inflammation and think, okay, I've got an intruder or I've got an injury. Either way, the immune system is going to be taking action. So it starts to talk to the nervous system. Got a problem, got a problem, got a problem. Nervous system is going to do what it can do. So, do what I can, it says to the immune system, and it does certain things which are helpful for acute situations. One of the things it does is pull down serotonin. Another thing it does is pull down dopamine. Now, why would it do those two things? Well, if you've got an injury or you got an infection, you should be resting, right? So it's doing those things. But you can see how chronically doing that's not going to be good. So you lose access to higher mood states because your brain's trying to respond to this chatter from the immune system. And what I would say further is that you've got this physiology that's being driven by inflammation. And there is indication that oxalate can even be causing neuroinflammation, not just inflammation in the body, but that it's managing to get through the blood-brain barrier. So if the nervous system is dealing with inflammation itself, it's got this constant chatter from the immune system, its proper functioning and balancing neurotransmitters are low, I think you get set up for anxiety to occur. And I particularly think that is also related to the fact that the gut's ground zero and that the vagus nerve innervates all of the abdomen and all of the digestive tract. And if that's inflamed, then the vagus nerve is kind of getting its tone reduced, as they describe it. It's sort of, you've taken down the signal on the vagus nerve. It's not functioning the way it should. So all these things, I think, can gang up on us. And then we end up with anxiety or a panic attack or whatever. And the challenge there is that while it's physiological, it's 100% physiological. I've got clients where I've said, I completely understand what you're going through. It's not you. You're not an anxious person. But we may feel like we're an anxious person because we've had this kind of stuff going on for such a long time. And in fact, I'm one of those people where my doctor said, I think you have an anxiety disorder. And I remember sitting in his office and thinking, no, something's wrong. And then eventually I found, yes, something's wrong. But we need to potentially come at that from a direction other than biochemistry. Everybody wants to go to biochemistry. They want to go to their diet. They want to go to supplements. They want a silver bullet. If you've been doing this chronic, unwell kind of life journey, then biochemistry may not be enough at this point. So if you've been chronically ill for long enough, your body's been dealing with physiological trauma because of what's happening with oxalate, and you may have dealt with medical professionals who didn't understand you, and so you've dealt with emotional trauma in response to all of your health issues. And so all of this stuff may need us to come from a completely different direction to try and get the nervous system to be our ally in the healing process. Because all this negative thinking it's essentially setting us up to be in fight or flight, because this is all dangerous and worrying and fearful, right? And if we're in fight, flight, or freeze, we are not running the metabolic pathways that do rest, digest, repair. And all of this kind of gets locked in because we've been chronically sick and dopamine and serotonin are down and blah, blah, blah. So we've essentially got a hardware and software combination here, which has been designed to deal with acute short-term stress. And now we have chronic long-term stress. So that's not just with what oxalate can be doing in your diet over decades. That's everything out there too. So I have found that if you really want to get over the healing finish line, so to speak, then you really have to dive down into how do I manage the nervous system so my brain is my ally? Because it's been doing the best it could with the programming and hardware that it's got, right? But how do I intervene so that I can untangle some of this cross wiring that may not be working for me? And for me, that's been having fun with different kinds of devices. So I've played with something called an Apollo Neuro. You wear it on your wrist. It stimulates the nervous system via vibration. It's a nice, gentle, I'm too exhausted, you can't make me do another thing kind of tool for when you're just at your wit's end. So I still have it. I still use it. I'm not wearing it today. I didn't think to bring it on. I do use a device which helps me to meditate, because I think, like a lot of us who end up chronically ill, that we may have developed a certain amount of ADHD to deal with trying to solve problems quickly because we're not well. And I almost wonder a little bit about our diet and sort of this ADHD thing. So my kids have told me that they've diagnosed me with ADHD. Not that I'm surprised, but I do think that for me, one of the things was that I was either trying to distract myself from my problems or I was too deep in them. And I've started to use a device called Muse, which tracks your brain waves so that you can understand what you're doing when you're trying to meditate. And that has been one of the best single things I've done. I signed up with the company to be an affiliate because it's just so good. Because I would have rather had my fingernails removed without anesthesia than do meditation. And I was out in my backyard this morning doing it for 15 minutes and then marveling, as I do every day now, which is, how was that 15 minutes? It felt like nothing.
Wow.
So just getting that brain to be able to come down off the problem, sort of train yourself to be able to step back from a reaction. And meditation really does that, so that you can kind of view what's going on without having the emotion and the physical sensations just take you away with it. And so I have been really talking to people about that side of things, because if you've been chronically ill, there's stuff there you have to do. And some of the research on the polyvagal theory, which is Stephen Porges' theory of the vagus nerve, has been fascinating and had some great applications. So another thing that I now offer through my office is something called the Safe and Sound Protocol. I have done this myself, and my colleague that I brought on has been trained in delivering this protocol. So I'm very happy. I have a new associate. Her name's Ali Walensky, and she's working with this. But what I liked about Safe and Sound is that it's very simple. Again, people are tired. They may have chronic fatigue when they've been chronically ill. And this is a program where they take music, process it in a way so that it stimulates the vagus nerve, because the vagus nerve is passing right by the ear. And the technology was developed for people who have sensory processing difficulties, so it's meant to be gentle. It's also been used with people who have an autism diagnosis. And the idea being that we send a signal signal to the brain that you're safe. Now, if that brain's been living in a body that's been chronically ill for decades, that brain does not feel safe. It's trying to constantly solve a problem, and it's not a problem that can be solved without the consciousness, but the subconscious is probably busy there doing all kinds of things. So if we can get that brain feeling safe, like if we can send it a signal that it's safe, again, you start to get some distance between physical symptom and nervous system. And then you get the ability to choose a response, maybe some tools that can calm yourself. Like a combination of these kinds of things can be unbelievably helpful. And interestingly enough, one of my clients is a functional medicine psychiatrist who started to send her clients to me because she realized that oxalate was part of this deal with why some people had such difficult symptoms that they could not deal with. And one of the tools she referred me to was this app called Curable. I had seen it before. I thought it was totally bogus. I had no interest in it whatsoever. But she had used it because she had gone on a low oxalate diet and she had ankylosing spondylitis, which is a really nasty form of arthritis and lots of pain involved. And she had gotten her pain levels from like a 9 or 10 every day with lots of pain meds to try and deal with that, down to about a 4 by going low oxalate. But she had this bit of pain that didn't seem to resolve, even though she was doing everything. We were at this everything right, but it's not quite working. And so she herself tried this Curable app, and that was what got her to the point where her ankylosing spondylitis was most days 0 to 1. And so I actually tried that as well, just to see what kinds of tools they had. It's a great program. So depending upon who you are and what kinds of support you need, there would be devices, there would be programs, there would be various kinds of tools where the goal in my mind is really make this nervous system your ally in the healing process. Because at the moment it's doing the best it can and it's not set up for this situation. We want to put you back in as the driver for the system, right? When I did that for myself, that's when I got that last bit of healing, because even I was going, well, I'm 80%. Maybe that's as good as it gets when you're in your 60s. And then I went, it's gotta get better. Anyway, so it can.
I love it. I love it. Monique, this has been such a fun conversation. I love your passion. I love that you're always learning something new and helping us create, again, unique episodes of our podcast. Certainly learned a lot today, and I'm so glad that you are absolutely thriving in your 60s. You look amazing. And like I said, I love your energy and your passion. So keep up the great work, and I'm sure we will have you back on again at some point for episode number 6. I can't wait for that. For now, where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you and your work?
Gosh, they can find me all over the place. I think my son, who does a lot of my social media stuff, actually has me on TikTok. So Lord help me.
Wow. Good luck.
Yeah, I'm not, if they find me there, it's great. Anyway, so TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. On Instagram, Low Ox Coach. On TikTok, Low Ox Coach. On X, I'm in competition with myself. So I'm Low Ox Coach 1 because I somehow managed to lose control of my first account and had closed the email or something. I couldn't prove I was me. Anyway, on Facebook, I have a Low Ox Coach page, and I do have a website, www.lowoxcoach.com. And for those who would like a bit more help but don't think they need a consult, and boy, I want to support people who want to do this journey on their own because I did it on my own, so it can be done. I have a Patreon channel, so patreon.com/lowoxcoach, and for $5 a month they can get all kinds of stuff on diet and supplements and whatever. And then for those who have a little more complexity, for $10 a month, they can get all of that plus a menu done every month where they're going to get recipes and ideas. And, and I handle some of this other complexity, like if you got a histamine problem, if you got a salicylate problem, if you got other things. And then for $15 a month, they can actually sit on a live Zoom call with me, which I think is a pretty good deal. So each level gets everything that the people before them got. So I'm really hoping that more people take advantage of that, because I think that's a great way to get some support, to understand more, to access somebody like me who's doing my best to read the research and tie together the dots as much as possible, and at a low cost. They can also find me volunteering some time every week at the Trying Low Oxalates group on Facebook. That's run by Susan Owens, and God bless her, I wouldn't be as healthy as I am today if not for her, because she's been running that group before I ever discovered oxalate. And that's another place where people can get some help, but it's a huge group. There's not a lot of hands on deck. And so it's hard to ask questions. So if you're a dig through a body of knowledge on your own kind of person, Facebook might do well by you. But if you need a little bit more where you can ask some questions, then I'd suggest my Patreon group.
Gotcha. Well, that sounds like a wonderful value. We'll be sure to link to all of that in the notes. And like I said, Monique, always just wonderful to host you. I really enjoy our time together. Thank you so very much for all of your work. And thank you for taking the time to be on our show again today. We really, really appreciate you.
You're one of my favorite interviewers, Casey. So if you ask me, I'll come back.
That's great. Well, thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to chat with you.
Thanks,
and this
Casey.
has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.